All right, I want to thank you for coming out for session 2 of your Discipler training. At the first session, we kind of went over my 10 principles, some simple stuff. Here we'll get into a little more detail of how this works and how it can look. But first, I want to give you a history lesson. So brace yourself. Adolescent, secondary school, and the role of adults. Brief history of youth ministry. There used to be no such thing. Youth ministry is very much an advent of the 20th century. It's actually an advent of the late 20th century, since 1950s and 1960s. Before then, you didn't have youth ministry. It had never actually been heard of or spoken of. But this little thing called the Industrial Revolution came along at the end of the 1800s. Prior to that, you went to school, to the farm. There was no transition period. You went from being a kid who was useless in the fields to being a hardworking field kid. And that was just how life was. And when you got to be 16, 17, 18, you married somebody from the same town, and life went on. And that was just normal. But around the Industrial Revolution, we learned that suddenly we needed people who were better educated. That period of schooling through roughly, if you were lucky, 8th grade, more likely 6th or 5th, just wasn't enough. So we invented this thing called the middle school and the high school. So we postponed adulthood for these kids by about 6 years. What they used to transition out around age 12, they now are transitioning out around the age of 18. Why? They needed to be better educated. So suddenly we created this thing called an adolescent. This too had never been even heard of. The first time it's mentioned in a journal is in the 1920s, was when the word first shows up. What's fascinating to watch for those of us like me who kind of study adolescence psychology and development is look at how in Asian countries that have really become industrialized, especially in China, they're finding out they now have adolescents. And they're saying, what the heck is going on? We didn't used to have these. So what's an adolescent? An adolescent is a biological adult without the full maturity. The clinical definition of adolescence is the onset of puberty. So at that point, you become capable of having a child, but you don't have the full maturity. You're not an adult yet. You're not responsible. You don't have the same responsibilities of taking care of yourself, etc. But that's basically what an adolescent is. So in the mid-50s and 60s, churches said, we need to do something about this. This has really changed. The face of public education had changed, and the church said, we need to do something. And in particular, this idea of relational ministry was born. And here's the basic formula. You take an adult who loves Jesus and combine them with a kid who may or may not love Jesus, and hopefully you will get the kid who loves Jesus. It was kind of this idea of moral influence. You were hoping that the positive influence of the adult would rub off on the kid to the point where they would say, hey, I want to love Jesus too. Okay? That was how it worked. And the whole point of the relationship between the adult and student was for them to develop a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That was the agenda. That was the game. That was what you were going for. And the kings and queens of this approach were, and still are, Young Life. Young Life does this better than anybody in the whole world. Why? Young Life sat down and said, you know what? The problem isn't the kids in church. It's the kids outside of church. So we need to concentrate on the schools. So Young Life recruited people who became volunteer soccer coaches, who became volunteer drama directors, who got engaged in the schools, and then set up basically clubs that weren't official, but that met outside of school, but they were connected to a school. And it worked wonderfully. This whole idea of relational ministry grew and took off, and they trained their volunteers tremendously. They did a great job, top-notch work by Young Life. How well did it work? It's very effective. I can tell you at least 4 people who I know personally who are now in ministry, who came from non-Christian homes, who say, I am in ministry and where I am today because of somebody who is affiliated with Young Life. It's highly effective. The problem is, well, there's one big. It's been critiqued for being manipulative and agenda-based. Here's the thing. The idea is that the adult in the relationship had a defined agenda. So you then could assess how effective your relationship was by whether or not that child wanted to accept Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. So you had an agenda at the outset. The problem with that is it's not really a relationship. They're your project. Now, I don't want to throw all of Young Life under the bus. Many of their volunteers got it. And they said, that's what I'm going for, but no matter what, I'm friends with this kid. But you also have stories of Young Life volunteers who took a strong interest in a kid. And when they didn't see them heading in the direction that they hoped, dropped them to concentrate on kids they thought were closer to developing that relationship with Jesus Christ. And they felt torched. They felt burned. Because here this adult had taken an interest in their lives, and suddenly they decided, you know what? No, he's not coming along, it's not happening. So that's the critique. And it is, in my opinion, a fair critique. Because whenever you have a relationship where someone is your project instead of a partner, you're bound to end up in some trouble. So what's the new model? What are people proposing to replace that model? And it's this idea called place sharing. Place sharing is very simple. An adolescent, in particular an early adolescent, needs to know that you're with them every step of the way, through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And my hope for you is that in your conversations, in your time with your students, if you talk about things that are specifically related to faith, the Bible, prayer, what's going on at church, great. If not, great. That's not the point. What is far more important is not necessarily what you say and what you talk about, but that they know that you're there for them. That's underlying everything that they need to know. Why? Well, as I said in the first meeting, belonging for an adolescent is actually more important than believing. There are people in this church, there are teenagers in this church, who I know are not sure what they think about Jesus. But they're here every week. Why? Because this is a place that they feel like they belong. The belief stuff tends to come later and they process that. And this is what I hear all the time. Because we have people who join the church. Why? Well, there's a baby. And you sit down and you say to them, so tell me, why you joined the church? Well, you see, when I was in high school, there was Mr. Peterson. And Mr. Peterson, he had us over for pancakes, before school, and he did this stuff with us. And now that I'm having kids, I want a place where my kid can belong like that. What you find out is that sense of belonging is what kept them there. The belief part came later. They sorted that out later on. But the belonging part was what kept them connected and kept them even interested. So the key is to create that sense of belonging. Your role is to simply be there for them and make sure they know you're looking out for them. That's very important. Trying to convince them to be a Christian is not part of the deal. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. I'm going to stop right there. Sometimes people say, but Ryan, you have a bunch of church kids. Aren't they already Christian? Yes, no, and maybe. At one point, every child needs to come to the point where their faith becomes something that they personally own. It moves from being something that they believe because their parents believe it to being their own. It has to happen. And if it doesn't, then they don't grow in their faith at all. It dies. So, more or less, yes. Are they on the Christian path? Yes. Is their faith their own? Not necessarily. Kids do this at different phases. To use an example, Cheryl's daughter made the jump very early. By 6th grade, her faith was her own. Me, didn't happen until I was a junior in high school. People hit it at different points. They make it their own and then they slide back. And they vary. But more than anything, the point is that at some point it has to become their own if they're going to continue to grow in faith. So yes, you have church kids, but that doesn't mean that they've taken ownership of their faith, that it has become theirs. And finally, instead of trying to introduce them to Jesus, you are part of the presence of Jesus in their lives. When Jesus says, I will be with you even until the end of the age, he wasn't kidding. The idea was through the power of the Spirit, Jesus is present with us. And we are present with those who are around us. So as the Holy Spirit fills us, yes, in some way, we are part of the presence of Jesus in someone's life. Sometimes we're not always the best at fulfilling that role, but that's part of the idea. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions on any of the background?